Today is June 18th, 2007. I am Cassie Potasic, and it is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Devils Lake, North Dakota. Can you please tell me your full name?
My name is Frances Teresa Schwan.
Okay. When and where were you born?
I was born June 16th, 1937 in Good Samaritan Hospital, Rugby, North Dakota.
Have you ever heard any interesting stories about your birth?
Only that my brother Simon said it was a very, very hot evening. And he said all the older kids were on the porch trying to sleep, and then when my dad came home at midnight, they all scrambled and went into bed, I guess. So that's the only thing, yeah. And then my sister Margaret said that when I was brought home, I was put into her arms, and then she literally raised me, and my mother denies that, so I don't know. I don't know which one is right, but they both probably are right to some degree.
Okay. Can you share your earliest memory with us?
My very earliest memory was being in the crib, and I can remember one of my brothers, I think it was my brother Al, he was about 7 years older. He was standing there looking at me but making no attempt to get me out or anything, and I remember thinking, why doesn't he help me out of here? My mother said she thought I was no more than 2 because she said most of her children were taken out of the crib at about 2, so that's my earliest memory.
Okay. Can you tell me about your grandparents?
My paternal grandparents were never in this country, and my maternal grandfather he had died. I remember my grandmother somewhat, but when I was growing up, she was getting quite elderly, so she didn't travel much, and we didn't get to her place very much, so I probably saw her, that I remember, maybe 5 times in my life. But she did come and stay with us in the summer a couple times, like a week or something like that. I just remember she always wore black. She had black.
Any reason?
I guess that's what widows did, you know, at that, in her memory. You know, she always had a black dress on.
Okay. Do you remember anything else about your grandmother?
I remember her coming and bringing us candy one time. It was chocolate-covered raisins, and we ate them all, and I couldn't eat them for years after that. And one time she came and visited us. We were living in Kandu at that time, and we went to the fair, I remember. But she wasn't able to walk around, so we couldn't stay too long. But you know, I remember my mother bringing her a treat to the car, but she was not, you know, she couldn't walk around or anything and really enjoy it. So.
Okay. What was her name?
Her name was Margaret Jager Volk. Her maiden name was Jager.
Okay. And where did she live?
She lived south of Rugby with my aunt Margaret and her family.
Okay. Do you remember any of your other relatives of that generation, great aunts and uncles?
No, I really don't. No,
Okay.
I don't remember anybody her age. I think her brothers were gone.
Okay.
They had died. I'm not sure. I think there might have been one brother alive, but I'm not sure. I just don't remember them.
Okay. Do you remember when she died?
Yes, yeah, it was the first death that was close to me, and it was in 1951, I remember. I remember going to the funeral. Simon and Pat picked me up and we went to the funeral, I remember that.
Okay. Can you tell me about the funeral?
Yeah, I just, you know, I don't remember a lot about it, but it was in March of 1951, and there was snow on the ground, and there was some debate about why they were burying her. There was still snow on the ground. And I remember my oldest brother, Vincent. I remember him crying, and I thought, well, he knew her a lot better than I did, you know. He felt really bad, so.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your grandma?
I really don't, you know, I don't really remember much about her, so I guess not.
Okay.
I just remember a month after she died, my cousin also died very young. She was only 16. My cousin Vivian Shell. So we went back for another funeral a month later to Rugby.
Were you close to her?
Well, I didn't know her real well either because we had moved away from Rugby about 7 years earlier. We moved to Camden, then we moved here to Devil's Lake and on the farm, and so I didn't see her a lot either. So.
Okay. Can you tell me about your other cousins? Were you close to any of them?
Yeah, Vivian's younger brother, or younger brothers and sisters. She just had one older brother. We would see him maybe once a year or so is all. You know. Yeah, we didn't see him a lot, so I don't really remember. I mean, I know them now, but I mean, I didn't see them a lot as kids. So.
Okay. How about aunts and uncles? Were you close to any of them?
Aunt Margaret I knew quite a little bit, and my Uncle Al. These are my mother's brother and sister. And then she had an older brother, Clement, which I think I saw just a couple times in my life.
Were they your favorites then?
Yeah, I'd say Aunt Margaret and Uncle Al, yeah. Especially Uncle Al, he was very good-natured, so.
Can you tell me some more about Uncle Al?
Uncle Al? Oh, he liked to party. I remember at dances and stuff, he liked to party. I remember that about him. But he was nice to visit with, and his wife, Aunt Elizabeth, was very nice to visit with. I probably knew her the best of any of my aunts and uncles because she was around longer. And as I was growing up and growing up, I saw her, when I would come to town.
Can you tell me some more about her?
Well, she was very good-natured, and she was nice to be around and visit with, yeah. And she had some old furniture of my grandmother's, that were antiques and stuff. And she had a few antiques. I remember there were a couple things we wish we had because we were closer to my grandfather than she was. She was not a blood relative, but she had them. I think her children have them now. So.
Okay. How did you stay in touch with each other, with your extended family?
Well, most of my adult life I lived in St. Paul, so letters and a few phone calls and visits.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about your extended family?
I guess nothing I can think of. No.
Okay. Then will you tell us about your father?
Oh, sure. uh, he liked to kind of tease and joke around, and I guess at one time he was very creative. I guess I inherited my art ability from his side of the family. My grandfather, Paul Schwan, was a carpenter, so he was creative. And my dad he did it, carpenter work, and he did a little bit of everything.
Can you tell me some more about your father?
Yeah, I have memories of my father that I know some of my other brothers and sisters don't have. When we lived in Kandu, my sister was going to St. Mary's Academy here in Devil's Lake. She entered there in high school, and we used to go down Friday nights from Kandu and pick her up. And it would be, in the fall of the year most of the time, and when the roads were good. And he would like to sing. He'd sing Old Black Joe. He liked to do that, and I still have real fond memories, of the two of us in the car going down, and he'd be singing. I guess he was in the church choir when he was a younger man, and he liked to sing. But I have that memory nobody has. And then also, he always liked to have one of his kids with him, and like if a part broke down in a machine, because we were farmers, and we'd have to drive and go get it, and I'd go with him, and we'd go down. And he'd go get his part, and he'd give me a dime to get a treat. I'd go get a treat, and then we'd drive home again. But he liked to have one of his kids with him. He liked to do that. So we did that.
Where was he born?
He was born in a colony of Strasbourg, Russia, in 1890. And he came to this country at the age of 15. And he had a lot of memories of Russia because of that, that age. And people were not allowed to leave anymore at that time without special permission. So he and his brother Anton and his cousin Dennis Schlick, they had to steal out of Russia in a hay wagon. They were buried in a hay wagon, and that's how they got out of Russia in order to get to another country where they could get passage. And then when they got to Ellis Island, they examined them, everybody, to make sure they didn't have diseases. So my dad had some kind of eye disease, and they wouldn't let him into the country, so they went back to England, and he had an operation on his eyes, and he always said that saved his eyesight. He would have been blind if they hadn't caught the disease. But he never even wore glasses in his later years. His eyes were so good. Yeah, it was amazing.
So when he got over here, where did he settle?
He settled, he had an uncle, Jacob Schwan, that lived in the Fulda area south of Rugby. And he and his brother stayed there. I don't know what happened to their cousin, but they stayed there and worked off their passage, because he had paid for their passage, I guess. And so they lived there for a few years and paid off their passage. And so my uncle actually married one of the daughters from that family. It was the first cousin, but he married one of the daughters from his uncle.
Okay. tell me how your father expressed emotions?
Well, I think he's a pretty feeling person, and he was pretty soft-hearted. He had a hard time disciplining children, I know that. I just remember one time him spanking me. It was only one time in my life, and I never forgot it. But usually my mother had to do the discipline.
Was she the stricter parent?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, he was real soft-hearted. He couldn't do it very well.
You sound like you were very close to him.
Yeah, I think I was fond of and close to both my parents. I was the youngest in the family, and so I was close to both of them.
Can you tell me when and where your father died?
He died here in Devil's Lake, October 1st, 1964. He had what they called at that time, they called it a coronary thrombosis. It was a massive heart attack. That was in the days before, they could operate and do bypass surgery. That wasn't available. He took these little tiny pink pills, which was the only thing available at that time for heart patients. And they were real tiny, and they were arsenic. A little bit of arsenic would help. Of course, a lot would poison you, but a little bit would help heart patients. That's all that was available at that time.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about your father?
Well, I guess not. I guess that would be it.
Okay. Can you tell us about your mother?
Mm-hmm. I have a lot of memories, probably more there. I can remember a memory. I don't think I was more than 4, and it was the fall of the year, and all the other kids were in school. I was still too young to go, and her making donuts. And I remember looking forward to the donuts she was making. It was a beautiful fall day. I was outside playing, thinking about the donuts, I guess.
Do you remember how she made donuts?
Yeah, she'd roll them out and then cut them with a cookie cutter, or a cutter with the middle cut out, and then fry them.
Okay.
I'm sure they were fried in lard, because that's how they did everything those days.
Did she put sugar on them or anything?
Yeah, I think she did. Yeah, sprinkled sugar on them. Mm-hmm. She had a sweet tooth, so there was a lot of sweet things around usually.
She do a lot of baking?
Yeah, she baked bread and cakes and pies and cookies all the time, yeah. I remember everything was homemade, and when we got store-bought cookies, it was a treat, and now it's just the opposite. The store-bought cookies don't mean anything, but a home-baked treat is, much better.
Can you tell me where she was born?
She was born in a colony of Mannheim in South Russia, the Ukraine. And she was 5 when she came to this country.
Did she come with her family?
She came with her mother and her father and her older brother, Clemens. He was 7. And also with my grandmother's brother, Ludwig Jaeger, and his family came. And her parents were supposed to come with them, but just as they were ready to leave, her mother died. So her father stayed. His name was John Jaeger, And so he stayed and came later. And he lived, I guess he lived in a little movable house. Simon probably told you about this, but a little movable house that they took between my grandmother's house and my mother's uncle Ludwig. They took this house back and forth, and because they just lived across the road from each other. So my grandfather or great grandfather would live in that house, and they would just move it back and forth. He'd go in the house and have meals, and then he'd go to his little house to sleep. So, different arrangement.
How did they move the house?
I don't know. It was like 10 years before I was born. But I imagine probably it was, I don't know if it was on wheels or what. But they would pull it back and forth. Could have been on a sled, I suppose. They pulled it back and forth.
Okay. Was she an affectionate person like your father?
My mother?
Yeah.
Well, I think she was, but she'd had a hard life, and she would show affection at times, but she was definitely the one who disciplined.
How were you usually disciplined?
Spanked, which I hated. I didn't like being touched, in anger. I still remember, I just hated it.
Did she ever work outside the home?
Well, we were on a farm. She worked outside. I guess it was typical in their society for the wife to keep the garden and take care of the chickens, that type of thing. She did that, yeah. And she preferred that to being in the house cooking. She didn't like to cook.
Did she like to bake?
She liked to bake, yeah. She was a good baker. She liked to bake.
Want to share anything else about your mother?
Yeah, I remember when we had moved from Rugby area where, everybody was German, and they would go and they would visit friends and relatives, or else friends and relatives would come over every Sunday. This was just, this is something that in their society that, they thought they had to have a balance, so they socialized, and they really enjoyed that. And she missed that a lot. When we moved to Candu, there was nobody, except our English neighbors. And she missed that a lot, and she would cry on Sundays because she missed that entertainment. But she insisted we have some kind of social thing, so we started going to movies in Candu. We'd go Sunday afternoons or Sunday evenings, we'd go to movies. So we saw all the movies in the 50s that came out. And there were a lot of them, that were really, really family-oriented movies, so we could go all the time.
Do you remember any of them?
Oh, do I ever? Yeah, I just loved going. I just loved movies. We used to see the Lassie movies, and I'd always cry. I couldn't handle it when Lassie was... Lassie'd always get into something and be hurt or lost, and I remember crying. But when the next Lassie movie came, I had to see it. But this was mostly during World War II, so there were a lot of war movies and that type of thing also. And there were a lot of Margaret O'Brien movies. Margaret O'Brien was just a little girl about, I don't know, started acting about at the age of 4 or 6, and she was a big star, so we'd always see all of her movies. There were a lot of musicals then, too, at that time. A lot of musicals that were fun to see. But movies in those days, you know, they were family oriented, so you could take a child. They were fun.
Were your favorites the Lassie movies?
The Lassie ones and the Margaret O'Brien ones, yes, because they were usually a musical. Like I don't know if you're familiar with Meet Me in St. Louis or some of those. Yeah, they were fun.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to tell about your mother right now?
Let's see, what else would there be? I guess that would be it. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me when and where she died?
She died, I think it was December 3rd, 1973, here in Devil's Lake. She had pneumonia. She lived to the age of 80, though, which was a lot longer than any of her brothers or sisters or, you know, had lived. So, you know, they were, my grandfather lived to, my great-grandfather lived to be 90, which was quite something in the 20s. He died in 1927 or 29, sometime around there. But very healthy, and my mother was very healthy too, so most of the time, so.
Wow. How many children did your parents have?
Actually, they had 15, 12 surviving. I had one sister who died at birth, or maybe was stillborn, I don't know. I think she died at birth. And another sister who died at 5 months, probably crib death or something, because she wasn't ill. And then I had a sister who was just older than me, 3 years older than me, and she died at the age of 6. That one I remember really well, because I was 3 years old. And she died of a burst appendix. So in those days, there's nothing they could do. Even nowadays, I guess it's hard to survive a burst appendix.
You said you remember it really well.
Yeah, I remember her, you know, being ill in bed and the doctor coming. And she'd been ill a couple days and it was just too late, you know. And I remember being at the funeral. Not in the church, but I remember the cemetery for some reason. She was buried in April of 1941. I remember being at the cemetery.
Do you remember there being a wake or anything like that?
No, I don't remember the funeral. I don't remember the wake. I just remember the cemetery part.
Yeah. Okay. Can you tell me more about your siblings, the birth order of them?
Okay, Vincent was the very oldest. And he was quite a lot older than I was. Like, I think he was 23, 24 when I was born. And I always liked him a lot. He was very good-natured. He laughed a lot, I remember that. And I remember after he got married, going overnight and staying with him and his wife. And I was probably 2, around that, something like that.
You have a good memory.
Mm-hmm. I have kind of a partially developed photographic memory. You know. It's not as good as some people's, but it's
Wow. Who's your next sibling?
That would be my sister Mary.
Mary?
Everybody, my older brothers and sisters were all named after somebody. My brother Vincent was named after my maternal grandfather. His name was Vincent Volk. And then my sister Mary, her name, we called her Mary, her name was Mariana. She was married after my paternal grandmother, who I never met. She never came from Russia. And she was 21 years older than I was, so I don't have a lot of memories. But I remember when we lived in Kandu, they also lived there and going over and staying overnight and visiting. I just remember she was a very good cook. Her food always tasted so good.
Do you remember any of the things in particular that she used to cook?
I remember some kind of rice or something that she cooked one time, and I thought it was so good. And then later on, she made a lime meringue pie. It was just delicious. She's a very good cook.
Who's your next sibling?
That would be my sister. Oh, Sister Barbara. Her real name was Barbara, and she became a sister, a nun. And first she took the name Sister Eloisha, but in the 1960s, when they relaxed the rules, she took her own name back and became Sister Barbara Marie. She added Marie on. And of course, she was out of the house at the age of 13. I never lived in the same house with her. So there were very few visits. At that time, they were very strict. So she came home for a home visit when I was 8. That was the first time I ever was in the same house, stayed overnight, with her. And she's still alive. She's 90 now, going to be 90 in August.
Wow. So you never spent much time with her as a child?
No. It's just home visits, and once in a while we would go see her, maybe once a year, because she taught all over the state. And then she'd write and tell us when would be a good time to visit. But she was only allowed very few visits. But that changed after the Vatican II in the 60s, and I saw a lot more of her then.
Okay. Next one.
The next one would be my sister Margaret. She's the one that said I was placed in her arms when I came home from the hospital, and that she raised me.
But you don't remember if that's true or not?
Well, my mother claims it wasn't true, but...
So were you close to her?
Yeah. Yeah, she talks about a lot of things that I really don't remember when I was 4 when she got married. And I just remember they had she and her husband, John, they owned a grocery store in Balta, North Dakota. And we would go and visit, and we'd always come home with a bag of candy, I remember. And there would be, they always had, bananas, and they didn't always get sold, so they'd be kind of ripe. And she'd always let us eat all the bananas we wanted because they were too ripe to sell. And that was just as big a treat as the candy, I think, at that time. And then I remember a lot of visits. She always wanted me to visit, and I remember a lot of visits. Staying overnight. When we had moved to Kandu, they moved here shortly after, a few years after. They moved to Devil's Lake. And I would stay sometimes with them, for a few days.
Anything else about Margaret?
Yeah, later on when I entered the 6th grade, both my brother Morris, who was just older than I was, went into high school at St. Mary's here in Devil's Lake, and so they decided they'd send me too. So I started at St. Mary's in the 6th grade, and I stayed at her house for about 3 years, going to school in the wintertime. Then go back to the farm in the summer.
Was it fun for you to be able to stay with your sister?
Yeah, yeah. She had 2 children at the time, and yeah, she always had different food that we never had at home. Her husband worked in a grocery store, so he was always bringing stuff home, so that was kind of fun. And at night we'd go for rides.
In a car?
Yeah. Wasn't in a horse and buggy.
Just checking. Maybe she had horses and you went just on the horses. Who is your next sibling?
Let's see. My next sibling would be my sister Matilda, and she got married and moved to California when I was quite young. I have very few memories of her. I just remember when we moved to Kandu, her husband was in the service during World War II. So she came and stayed with us, I think, for about a year or so. And then the war was over and they went back to California. But I have very, very few memories of her. And then when she moved to California, we didn't see her for a long time. I think it was like 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And then she came to visit one summer and with her kids, most of her kids, and went out to California a couple times and saw her in the 50s. But that's about it. I don't have many memories of her.
Okay. And after Matilda?
After Matilda is Simon that you met. I have a lot of memories of him. What was the first one I remember? I remember there's a picture where I'm sitting on a horse. It's just a colt. Pearl was her name, and we had that horse a long time. She was a really beautiful horse. And I remember I'm sitting on her and Simon's holding me. I think I was only like, I don't know, 2, 3, 2.5, 3. I don't think I was any older than that.
What else do you remember about Simon?
And then growing up, he was always around at Kandu for quite some time. And I don't know, I just remember him being around. I remember one time there was an unfortunate accident. I guess this was in the days before antifreeze, and the radiator froze up in the car. And he opened it up and it just shot up. The water must have been boiling hot, shot up into his face. And he went in. I don't know if he stayed in the hospital, but he got all bandaged up. His whole face was all bandaged. And he liked to kind of scare me. He looked pretty scary too. There were just holes for his eyes and his nose and his mouth, and he thought that was funny, you know.
How old were you when that happened?
Gee, couldn't have been very old because I was home. Must have been about 5. I wasn't in school yet.
Do you want to share anything else about Simon?
Yeah, I remember one Christmas, I think he'd been away for a while. He had gone to California to work during the war. He was too young during World War II to be in it, but he'd gone to California to work, and I think he came home around Christmas time, and he said, "Go in the bedroom, there's something there for you." I went in, and here was this beautiful sled. It was a flexible flyer, which was just the sled of all sleds, you know. And there it was sitting. I couldn't believe it. And I came out, and I just couldn't believe it. And he said, "Well, did you find something?" I said, "Yeah." And I just couldn't believe it was this beautiful sled. But it was just, you know, really a treat. We had sleds, but, you know, they were homemade ones. So, yeah, that was a big treat. And then one time, I think it was like for my 15th or 16th birthday, he brought over a lamb. It was a kind of, wasn't a pure white one. It had, you know, it was like grayed, had black in it, and it was just a beautiful little lamb. And we named it, he named it. He called it Liberace. Liberace was real popular at that time. It was in the 50s. And its fur was the same color as Liberace's hair, I guess. His hair was kind of curly like that, so we called it Liberace. It was just so much fun to have that lamb.
So you celebrated birthdays, not names days?
No, my parents, they never really celebrated anybody's birthday. They celebrated names days, yeah. Mm-hmm. But my dad didn't have a German name. His name was Dennis. But my mother was Barbara, and we would celebrate hers. I remember people coming, you know, to the house and celebrate St. Barbara. I think it's the first part of December or sometime there.
How did you celebrate a names day?
Oh, they always, there was always food and, you know, beer and wine usually. And they would make this red eye. I'm sure you've heard this story before. They'd take Everclear and add it to burnt sugar water, and it would be would make the Everclear more palatable. It was easier to drink that way. They would make that, and they usually had that. And I don't remember anybody ever getting drunk. Nobody ever did that. They'd drink just so much, and then I remember the men. My dad was always. I think he instigated it quite often. They would sing in German then. I remember that they sang a lot in German because a lot of like cousins and friends, they all knew the same songs and they'd sing. That was a nice time.
Do you remember any of the songs?
No, I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
No. Let me think. There was one called Ode to Lieber Augustin, and it was about this guy named Augustine. They would sing about that. I don't know the words or anything like that. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell me about Simon?
I stayed over at their house a lot after he got married, and they moved to Michigan, North Dakota, and his oldest child is my goddaughter. I remember going there a lot, and it was, I always enjoyed it a lot. It was fun. He liked to kid around a lot, especially when he was younger.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was always a lot of fun. And I remember I stayed there when their third child, Paul, was born. I stayed there and took care of the girls for about a week, I guess. Made the meals and stuff. And I kind of enjoyed that. That was fun. And I remember I made baked Alaska. My sister-in-law would let me do anything I wanted, and so I made baked Alaska, and it was really good. And then that was the first time I ever did it, and it turned out perfect. And after that, I tried it, and never turned out ever again.
What is that exactly?
Baked Alaska?
Yeah.
You take an angel food cake, and you scoop out the middle. The middle, you know how angel food has got a hole in the middle. And you just scoop around, you leave a lot of cake. And then you fill it with ice cream. And then you whip egg white, and you spread it all over real thick and make sure it's covered really well. And you put it in the freezer. You make sure everything is frozen real hard. And then you make the oven really hot as it'll go, and you put it in the oven for maybe 5 minutes, and it browns the egg white. And then you cut it, and the ice cream is still, hard. It's really good.
I'll bet. Well then.
This is easier than I thought because I didn't need these notes.
See, I told you. It'll be great. Who's next after Simon?
Then that would be my sister Monica. She lives in town here. And my memories mostly of her are when we lived in Kandu. I remember driving to town with her. She learned to drive, and she, in the summertime, when everybody was busy in the field, she'd run to town and run the errands and get groceries and stuff like that all the time. She would stay in Rugby in the wintertime and get a job, usually waitressing. And she was just a teenager. And then in the summertime, if my mother needed her, she'd come and stay for the summer and help out, because there was most of the younger children were boys, so they worked outside. There was just quite a space between the girls and and the younger kids, so she always needed her help.
Okay.
And then later on, I remember she moved to Devil's Lake here, and she stayed at my sister Margaret's. And I remember going to visit them. And she'd always have treats in her room. She had the attic. That was her area that she lived in. And she always had treats, always good things, to eat and stuff. Bananas and coconut and, I don't know, unusual stuff like that. It was always a treat. She always liked to have something like that, something special to eat.
All right. Who's after Monica?
Monica would be my brother David, and I guess I know him least of all. He was very quiet, and most of the family was kind of dark. David was a blonde, because my dad's family was blonde, but my mother was very dark. So mostly everybody was dark or brown-haired, but he was blonde. I just remember him being very quiet. Never talked much. Remember, he broke his ankle skating when I think he was about 25 years old at the time. And he was laid up all summer with that.
Was he still at home when that happened?
Yes,
about David?
I just remember going to trips a couple times to Grafton. My sister Margaret was living in Grafton with her family at that time. We went to see her a few times, and then, well, later on, after he got married and stuff, he would stop there. On my way home from the cities, I'd stop and visit them sometimes. But as far as growing up, there's not a lot of memories with him. I can't remember much
All right.
about him. He was a very quiet person.
Okay then, who is next?
Next was my brother Al. And he was pretty creative. I remember him building a little village. Well, it was not a village. It was a little farm with a barn and a house, and he put little electric lights in it. And I remember being really fascinated. It was really good. He really did a nice job with it. He was very good with his hands, doing creative things. And went into the Air Force and was over in Korea in the 50s. He actually wasn't in Korea. He would fly on those Globemasters. He was part of the crew. He wasn't the pilot, he was part of the crew. He was a navigator, I think, or something. And they would fly in those big, these big planes. They were called Globemasters in the 50s. And was maybe about 1953, one of them went down. It actually crashed, and like 80 people were killed. It was the biggest plane crash in the history of the United States at that time. But he was late. Normally he'd have been in front, in the cockpit. But being he got on late, he was in the tail end of the plane, and only 3 men survived, and he was one of them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was just really scary. We waited for days to find out what had happened.
Who came after Al?
After Al came my sister Bertha. Her name is actually, she found out, is actually Berta, which is a German name. But for some reason, on her birth certificate, the name got crossed out and Bertha substituted. Wasn't done by my father. He's the one that always reported the births, but somebody in the office decided it wasn't right, I guess. So she goes by the name of Berta now. Just remember, she was the only sister that was around much, and she was 6 years older than I was, but she was always, it's probably one of the kindest people I've ever known. And she was always around and always, had a lot of compassion and stuff, I don't think it's easy for anybody to grow up, but she was always there for me.
Was she the sister you were closest to?
Yeah, when I was little, yes. And I just liked it when she wasn't around. When it must have been, was I 6 or 7? And then she moved to Devil's Lake to go to school. It was St. Mary's was an academy at that time, so she stayed there, and then later with my sister, Margaret. But I just hated to see her go. I didn't want her to go. And I missed her so much. But then we would pick her up on Friday nights and bring her home for the weekend quite often. My dad insisted on it. I think that was one of the children that he was really fond of,
Okay. Anything else about her?
Yeah, I remember her wedding, and it was a beautiful affair. I guess it's the wedding I remember the most because I was older. I was 16 by that time, and it was a beautiful wedding in church here in Devil's Lake, St. Joseph's.
Can you tell me about it?
I just it was July 17th, 1953, and my future brother-in-law was in the service. He was I think in Kentucky already at that time. And she had, what, 5 attendants? I just remember thinking it was a nice, it was a really nice wedding. It was a big one for its time. And we all had, beautiful dresses that were made for us and stuff, and it was really nice.
Who made them?
It was a lady in town here who did sewing for a living. Her husband had died, and she did sewing for a living, so she made all the dresses. And they were, I think they were in different colors, but the same material, so they were really pretty. And it was really nice.
What was her wedding dress like?
Oh, gee. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you. I just remember at that time in the 50s, these white dinner jackets were real popular for the groom and the groomsman and best man. They wore those. I remember that was different at that time. It was just new, and they were starting to do that. And she had a big dinner. There was a big dinner and a dance and stuff. And
Red eye?
probably. Yeah, there probably was. Yeah, because I'm sure my dad was in charge of the liquor, I think. So I'm sure there was some red eye.
Do you remember anything else about it?
I remember my cousin coming from Rugby with her family. She was just newly married and had a little girl. And 2 of my nieces were like 2.5 and 2 years old, and they were so beautiful, all dressed up. They were real dark haired, and they had these pink dresses on. They looked so cute. I remember that. And then our local priest that married him was a relative. His name was Father Morris Jager, and he was a relative. And he came to the reception, of course, and the dance, and he had a good time. And some of his visiting brothers and sisters were at the wedding too, I guess, and they all had a good time. They were party people.
And then who came after Berta?
After Berta, wait a minute. Did I talk about my brother Al? I did, didn't I? Yeah, okay. My brother Morris. He's the one that lives northwest of town here. Rosemary is his wife. He was closest in age, and we were always fighting. It wasn't on my part. But we did have a real tragedy. He was 11 and I was about 7, and he was in the barn and in the stall with a horse, and I don't know why this happened, but he was behind the horse, which I was told never do that, because you'll get kicked. Well, he was there and he got kicked, and he almost didn't survive. He was kicked in the head, and he almost lost his leg, but he was in very bad shape. I remember they took him from Candu to the Fargo hospital where they could treat him better. And he was there a whole month before he came home. And then when he came home, neighbors brought him gifts, We got a Monopoly game, I remember, that we played for years after that. And got other gifts from neighbors. And
So he was fine after that month?
Well, you know, his leg was in a cast, and I guess he couldn't walk on crutches. It was just too big. So we got some kind of a used wheelchair, and I remember having to push him around it, and I didn't appreciate that too much. But he had problems with that leg for years afterwards. And he still says now when the weather changes, he can tell it from his leg aches, you know. So.
Okay. Anything else about Morris?
We fought a lot when we were little, but we became, you know, pretty good friends when he was about 18, 19, and I was a teenager too.
What did you fight about?
Well, he instigated it. Don't ask me. You'll have to ask him. I think he always thought I got more than he did, or I was more spoiled than he was. Both of us got more things than my older brothers and sisters, because there were so many of them. My parents didn't have the money. And at Candu, they were prosperous, and he had a Cushman scooter and a pony and stuff, and I had a bike and phonograph and different things when I got to be a teenager. So we got more things, you know, but that's what happens, I guess, in large families. And my older brothers and sisters had one bike that they rode, you know, for years and years.
Anything else?
Well, I remember a little bit about my sister Tilly. She came after Morris. She's the one that died at the age of, she was almost 6. But I guess I told you what I remembered about her, because I don't remember anything other than when she died. Yeah, sick and died, yeah.
Was that really hard on your family?
Yeah, I think it took my mother a long time. I don't think she ever got over it, because she would mention it, you know, from time to time. I know it was really, really hard for her. Being 6 years old. And she always said David and Tilly were her good kids. They were the easiest children to raise. They were always good.
So does that make the rest of you mischievous troublemakers?
Well, I don't know. Not as good, though. Probably gave her more trouble. I'm sure I wasn't an easy child to raise.
Is that all of your siblings now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's quite a lot.
Yeah. It's a big family. Anything else you'd like to tell me about them right away?
I think I pretty well covered that area.
Yeah. Okay. What kind of mischief did you guys get into?
Mischief. I don't think we did too much. I played alone most of the time, because my brothers, especially my brother Morris, he was always working. Even when he was real little, he was always working. He still does. I think there was one thing, mischief. I remember one thing doing, I remember we went to visit, I think it was the Louis Hufford family. And I think the guy was a cousin or second cousin to my mother. And visited their family, and their kids would go into the egg house and take eggs and make mud pies with them. And I thought, oh, that's a great idea. So when I went home, I did the same thing. And then my niece came over, and I guess we were making mud pies, because I had nieces close in age to me. And anyway, my mother found out about that, and she didn't think that was too good of an idea to do that, so put an end to that.
You got in trouble for that?
Well, no, I don't think I really did. She just said not to do it.
Okay.
I remember playing with Al and Morris, and Al was always pretty creative with things, and he made some kind of a gun. It was just wood, and then you take cut strips from an inner tube. You probably don't know about inner tubes in tires from a long time ago. Well, he'd cut strips, and then you'd pull it back, and it would, you'd shoot each other with them. I remember playing with them with that. I thought that was great fun.
What else did you play?
Oh, gee. I liked animals a lot. And I guess I always played with the cats. I would, in the farm you always have a lot of barn cats. But it was always fun in the spring to find a nest of kittens. And I'd go in and I'd tame the kittens, because the kittens were tiny and they would tame, but the mother would be wild, so she'd see me coming and she'd run. But I'd play with the kittens, but we had a lot of cats. I really liked cats. But we had sheep too, so there were lambs, and there were always orphan lambs that we had to feed because the mother would die, but maybe one or two every season is about all. And we had, with sheep, you always had a billy goat in those days. I don't know what the reason was, but there was always a billy goat. There was some reasoning, but I don't know what it was. And I remember one Sunday morning, everybody was in church. I was probably about 7 or 8. And I had a stomach ache or something, so I was home alone. Everybody was in church. And I remember stepping out on the steps, and down by the barnyard was this billy goat, and he was mean. And I remember looking down there at him, and he came running up, racing up, and I guess I was mesmerized because I just looked at him, and he came up and he pushed me off the front steps because they had horns, billy goats. He just went up and pushed me right off, and I just stood and watched like a dummy. But he was mean. You didn't want to be close to him.
Did he have a name?
I don't remember. I'm sure he did, but I don't know what it was.
Okay.
Yeah, everything had a name. Everybody, the horses and some of the cats and the dog always had a name, but I don't remember. It was probably Billy.
Okay. What other pets did you keep?
Well, we always had a dog. There was always a dog. And I remember, let's see, what else did we have? We had a crow. My brother Al got this baby crow. And it was my job to feed the crow every day. And he was going to, the reason he captured this baby crow was he was going to teach it to talk, which he never did. So every day I'd have to go out there, I'd feed him. I think it was just bread and milk. I don't know why we fed him that, but it was a baby, I guess that's why. So we fed him that, and I don't even know what happened, but the crow was tame. And then eventually he just let him go. you know, and he would just kind of hang around sometimes, but because he was tame. But and what else? Oh, I had a little red hen one time. It was a Rhode Island red. It was a bright red chicken, and it was so tame. It would just love it. I'd catch it and pet it, and it would just sit there. What else? The geese. We had geese. They were never pets. They were mean. Ducks were nice, though. We had ducks too at one time. Ducks were nice. I had a bunny rabbit one time, I think, that my brother found. It was just a baby. Yeah, that's about the only pets.
Okay. Well then, how about you tell me about some other games you played?
The games. Well, we always had sled and ice skates. And there were always some, sloughs that were frozen over. We'd skate on those, but they were bumpy, And always played with sleds, yeah. Always played outside. Those are the outside things. We played Monopoly a lot. We had a Monopoly game that I think we just wore out. I think it was just all ragged. And as a family, we played cards at the table. I learned to play whist when I was really young. And one time, my brothers came home this is when we were living in Kandu. I was only about 8. They came home and they'd been to a neighbor and they said, "We've got a new game." And so we all sat around to play this new game. It was penny ante poker. So, so we all played poker as a family for pennies, sitting around the table. I know I was only about 8 at the time. But I still enjoy. I don't get a chance to play poker, but it's fun.
Anything else? What else did you do for entertainment?
Well, in the 40s, we listened to radio. Yeah. We listened to Fibber McGee and Molly and Red Skelton and Fred Allen. My mother always, every morning, would listen. Kate Smith would sing on the radio. And I think that was like early, about 9 o'clock in the morning. My mother would listen to that every morning. And she had some soap operas she listened to on the radio.
Do you remember the soap operas very well?
I think Ma Perkins was one of them that she listened to, but I don't remember any of the others.
What was your favorite?
My favorite on radio growing up was The Shadow, and it was real intriguing.
What was it about?
It was, I think it was a murder mystery, but the theme was the shadow knows, and the shadow was made out to be kind of scary figure, but he's actually good. He would find out who did the murders. And that was fun. And then The Lone Ranger was a big one, and when I was growing up. And Bobby Benson of the B-Bar B or something like that. I can't remember. That was a big one. Listen to that. There were some others, but I can't remember.
Were there any of these that the whole family would sit down and listen to together?
Oh yeah, like Fibber McGee and Molly and Red Skelton, yeah, Fred Allen. Oh, and Saturday nights there was the hit parade. We always had the hit parade, and they would sing. It was with Perry Como, Joe Stafford, and one other person. I don't remember who it was. But they'd have all the big hits of the week on, and they'd sing them, and that was fun to listen to. We always listened to that. And later on, like when I was about 13, I used to listen to Lux Radio Theater. And they'd have stars on. It would be all on radio. And it would be stars. And it would be, you know, some kind of story. I don't remember any of the details or any of the stars, but...
Okay. Is there anything else you did for entertainment?
We always, every year, went to the fair. Candu had a state, or a county, I think it was county fair. We always went to that. We'd watch, they always had these acrobats. They were called the Gallaghers, I remember. And it was a Gallagher family, and we always watched that in the grandstand. And then they'd have some horse racing. And of course they'd have, you know, merry-go-round and different rides and different things. Candied apples, I remember those. Yeah. And we went to movies quite a lot, you know, usually a Sunday now, Sundays, like I said. We always did special things for religious holidays, of course. And the two holidays that were not religious that we celebrated was, of course, Thanksgiving and the 4th of July. My parents always celebrated the 4th of July.
What did you do for the 4th of July?
Well, I remember one year going to a rodeo. One year we went to a movie in the evening. I remember I was really young when we went to that movie. And I remember a big Mickey Mouse head. That I can still remember that on the screen, this big Mickey Mouse head. And if there wasn't anything, you know, anything going on, then my dad would go get a treat, like maybe ice cream or pop quite often, and candy or something. But we'd always have something special for the 4th.
Did you make ice cream, or did you?
Oh yeah, But only in the wintertime was the only time we had ice. We didn't have electricity, but we made ice cream in the winter. Usually.
How did you make it?
We just had one of these old-fashioned turn freezers. It was a I think it was a wooden container, and you put ice around it, and in the middle was an aluminum cylinder that, you know, my mother would fill up with cream and sugar, and sometimes it would be vanilla, sometimes, usually it was chocolate. She made chocolate ice cream. And then you'd have to turn this crank to keep it rotating, and that was a lot of work. I remember we'd take turns cranking that thing till it became ice cream.
Okay. You mentioned that sometimes you went to rodeos on the 4th?
Just one time, yeah, we were in Candu. We came to Fort Totten, I think, had a rodeo south of town here every year for the 4th. We just came one time, I think, that's all I remember.
Did you ever go to a rodeo any other time?
I think I went once at Mandan,
Okay.
years later.
Okay. Well then, how did you celebrate Thanksgiving?
Usually, my brothers and sisters would come home with their families, so it was a pretty big affair.
I bet.
Yeah. Yeah. We have two. We never had enough room, so we always have 2 seatings. And then I think there was a children's table, but it would take 2 seatings to feed everybody, and we had a big table, but it was a lot of work. I remember that.
What kinds of foods did you have for Thanksgiving?
Just the traditional. Yeah, we had the traditional. Nothing unusual or nothing, no German dishes or anything.
Okay.
For Christmas and Easter, though, we had traditional German foods. I remember my mother used to make this Christmas bread,
Okay.
and at Easter it was an Easter bread that she would make. We'd always have ham with it for Easter.
Can you tell me more about how you celebrated Christmas?
Yeah, we were a Catholic family, so we always had a tree and gifts and stuff. But and we'd go to midnight mass, and then but we did have these German tradition of the Christkindl would come. I'm sure you've heard this one before. And we'd have little baskets, and there'd be candy and nuts, and always an orange, because I guess my mother growing up in well, not growing up, but coming from South Russia, an orange was a big treat in the wintertime. You just didn't have them, you know. So it was a big treat. So we always got an orange, even though it wasn't anything unusual for us anymore. But and then at Easter we'd get an Easter basket. And we'd have candy Easter in it, Easter eggs, but we'd also get real Easter eggs and have to go for Easter hunt, hunting for Easter eggs.
Did you dye them?
Yeah, but they were dyed by my mother and my sister, and I didn't know about it until I must have been at least 8. And they were dyeing Easter eggs, but I was sent outside, and I happened to look in the window, and here they're dyeing Easter eggs, and I thought, those are supposed to come from the Easter Bunny. So I went inside, and they said, "What are you doing?" And they were kind of sheepish about it, but, you know, then after that I helped dye Easter eggs too. But,
What did you use to dye them?
well, we had commercial stuff that we got from the store, yeah.
Okay. Can you tell me anything else about Christmas or Easter at your house?
Yeah, it was always a lot of fun. You always looked forward to it a lot because there'd always be nice gifts and stuff. And then
Did you get gifts just from your parents, or did the brothers and sisters exchange gifts too?
yeah, well, yeah, I had so many married brothers and sisters, so they would give my parents a gift, and then I guess the kids that were at home would get gifts. I always got something, nothing, you know, just a small gift, something little, but yeah. Trying to think of what else. It mostly centered around the church. We went to church both Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And my parents liked to concentrate on the Christ part of it more than anything.
So religion was very important to your family?
Oh yeah, my parents were very strong. Both my mother and my dad, very strong on religion.
Can you tell me what a typical Sunday would have been like?
Oh, yeah, we would go to church and come home, and there'd be always a big dinner. It was usually soup and chicken. My mother always liked to have, because beef and pork were normal for, you know, normal workday meals, but chicken was always special for Sundays. We always had it, yeah. And it was delicious chicken. It was homegrown. It was delicious. And always, you know, my mother would always bake pies for Sunday dinner. She didn't usually have them during the week, but for Sunday dinner, I remember sitting in church when I was quite young thinking of the lemon meringue pie we were going to have that day.
Were you required to go every Sunday?
Yes, yes, we always went. Unless, sometimes when we lived in a farm in Candu, we'd get snowed in. I mean, the snow would be real deep, and we just couldn't get anywhere for a couple of weeks. So.
Did you have some sort of ceremony at home then if you couldn't go to church?
Yeah, my mother would, or somebody would lead the rosary. We'd pray the rosary or have something. And
did you sit with your family in church?
oh yeah, At Candu we did. When we lived south of Fulda, the men were on one side and the women on the other, so we didn't. And then when in Candu, the families sat together, and they always sat in the same pew. They were supposed to sit in the same pew. So we had our pew. We had a whole pew. But a lot of my brothers and sisters, were married by that time. So, and then when we moved to northeast here in Devil's Lake, we went to St. Benedict's Church, and they were old-fashioned too. The men sat on the right side and the women on the left, so the family didn't sit together anymore. But then later in the 50s, that changed. Some of the families started sitting together, and then that changed.
Okay. What were some of the religious activities that you took part in?
Well, I think we always had, religious instruction, like before Mass on Sundays. I think there was a little bit of religious instruction. And then in the summertime, we'd go to religious instruction. They called it catechism, for 2 weeks every summer. And we'd go into town and have instruction then. It would be for a whole day. I think it was a whole day. Sure seemed like it. For 2 weeks.
What were those instruction periods like?
Well, gee, I just don't remember much about it at all. It's funny.
Okay.
But we learned prayers and, different things and different teachings.
Was there ever any German involved in your churches?
No, not after we moved from Fulda, south of Rugby there. There wasn't then, no. Okay. Everything was in English then.
All right. Were you baptized or confirmed?
I was baptized, yes, at St. Anselm's in Fulda, and received my first communion at Sacred Heart Church in Candu, and I was confirmed at St. Joseph's here in Devil's Lake when I was 12.
Do you remember the first communion ceremony?
Oh yeah. Actually, I was only 6, and I really didn't understand it as well as I should have. But I remember we all lined up and marched into church, and as a group, we all sat together. I knew it was a big deal, but it was during the war. I think it was like in 1942, and it was during the war, and you wore white. Little girls all wore white, and we couldn't find white shoes because of the war. I don't know why that was, but so I remember I wore saddle shoes, which were mostly white but a little brown. You know how the saddle shoes look. But I remember we looked all over, we couldn't find them, so we took whatever we could find.
Did you have a new dress?
Yes. I think my mother made it. It was all white and it had some some trim and color on it. Yeah, I remember that.
Did you celebrate at home afterwards?
I guess we did, just the family, at home. Yeah. Now they have big celebrations, but at that time it was just the family at home. Yeah. I think we just had our usual Sunday dinner, which was, more elaborate than the regular dinners anyway.
All right. Do you remember anything else about your first communion?
No, I really don't. Just remember marching into church with these other little kids.
Yeah. Okay. How about getting confirmed?
Oh yeah, I was 12 then. And in those days you couldn't use a relative you had to have a sponsor, but you couldn't have a relative. So
Okay.
I remember we were trying to think who I could ask. And so a friend of my sister Margaret's was my sponsor. I remember walking over there and asking her if she would do it. Oh yeah, she said. So I didn't know the lady very much, but she was my sponsor. And I remember the bishop coming. It was quite something for the bishop to come into town at that time. He didn't travel like bishops do now. They travel and they come quite often, but in those days they didn't. And yeah, church was full, packed with people,
Sure.
Yeah. And I got another name then too. You can get another name. So I chose, you can choose any name you want. So I chose Susanna. I thought that was a pretty neat name.
A saint's name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a celebration at home for the confirmation?
No, I don't think we did. No. I was staying at my sister Margaret's at the time, going to school here in town. So, and I think it was in the middle of the week that the confirmation was. So we didn't. I don't think we had anything special.
Okay. Well then, do you have anything else you'd like to tell me about church?
Guess not.
Okay.
I think I told you about Easter and Christmas. Those are the biggest ones.
Right. Did you enjoy going to midnight mass and?
I loved it,
Yeah.
except it was really hard to. We always opened our gifts on Christmas Eve, and then my mother would bring out, nuts and candy, and we'd have a celebration. And then at 9 o'clock, we'd all go take a nap, and that was the hard part. Getting up then at about 11, after 2 hours. I remember thinking, oh, I wish I didn't have to do this, and it was always cold. That was the hard part, but being in church was fun because it was always a Christmas program and it was always special. Yeah, that was fun. Mm-hmm.
What were the Christmas programs like at church?
Well, it was always, portrayal of Jesus and
The nativity?
Mary, and yeah, the nativity. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. Anything else about church? About religion?
No, I guess not. When we lived south of Rugby by Fulda, the family was real close to the priest and the housekeeper. You had a housekeeper. The priest we had at the time came from Germany, and the family was real close to him. I remember that. We lived a quarter of a mile from church, a quarter of a mile from school, so it was very convenient. For my parents, they didn't have to take kids to school. They just walked to church too. I remember going back and visiting. The housekeeper, her name was Teresa Lang, and she was my godmother. My middle name is taken from her.
Was it ever an issue in your family with people of different denominations?
Yeah. My parents were very strong in the religion, and they didn't want my brothers and sisters marrying a non-Catholic. That was a, very strong. My one sister, two of my sisters married non-Catholics, but one of them did. One of them turned Catholic, so he was Catholic, and the other one didn't. My sister in California. I don't think her husband ever turned Catholic. But yeah, it was, yeah. I remember, I remember when we went to Metcalf School in south of Kandu, coming from a German-Russian community to one that wasn't, and we were the only Catholics. And I remember feeling real different. I knew then that we were different people than these people. We weren't, because they were all Protestant, and they would hold something like a Bible study after school. I think it was like on Friday night or something. And we couldn't participate. We weren't allowed to. So my brother and I would stay outside school and wait for my dad to come, or somebody to come pick us up from school.